And today is Sean McDonald, who's the Senior Vice President of MCD, which is an FSG. And we're so thrilled to have both of you here to talk about this very interesting and spooky book. So thank you both, and take it away.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for coming out, and thank you, John. And
it's my pleasure. You got the memo that we're mainly going to be talking about A World of Breads by Dolores Casella, right? That this is it's been out of print for too long, and it's a very
that is the plan. That's what everyone's here with bated breath.
There's some amazing the brown sugar donuts recipe is just outstanding, and okay, expect more of that.
So Devil House. Stay on topic, John. It's
Sean,
your third novel.
It is my third novel, unless you count the novella Master of Reality. The first thing I published that brought me to the attention of Chris Paris Lamb, who's my agent, it's fiction, but it's also music criticism cloaked in that. So this is sort of my 3.5.
All right. The third book we've worked on together.
That's right.
And I mean, since the start of this book, you've talked about it as your big book. And I'm just sort of curious to talk about what that meant to you, and I don't know what it meant for how you approached writing the book and the plotting and all of that.
So, like I'm always, as anybody who's had breakfast with me knows, it's hard for me to make my responses, short and pleasant. But so from the first story I wrote, which was when I was 6 years old, I asked for and got a manual typewriter for my birthday. Right, it was an old Royal, like a 36 Royal, and I wrote a story called The Magic Bugle. I remember this because my father, my parents were divorced at the time. But my mom sent it to my dad, and my dad, he was my dad, right? He was an English professor, so he was extremely happy that his son, who was 6, had written a story whose first line was, "Once a bugle stood in the window of a store that sold brass goods." Right, and my dad would read that to his English comp classes at Cal Poly and tell them if they had written a sentence that good, then they will get their C. And so forth. But The Magic Bugle was a story about a bugle that runs away from a music shop and everybody tries to catch it. And it ended very abruptly because I didn't know what to do with the story, right? And I sort of, with everything I've ever written, I sort of reach a point of sudden arrest. And I'm really happy with my other books, but it's like I sort of always wondered what would happen if I let them expand, if I was more comfortable with an uncomfortable sort of lack of stasis, And that's what I noticed in big books I read is they're leisurely, right? That like if you read my big book of the year is Miljenko Jergovich's Kin, right? From Archipelago, which is like this incredible book. And he's incredibly patient. He like, if he gets distracted by a memory of something, it's not distraction, I mean, it's design, right? But for 90 pages, then he goes for 90 pages, right? And as Sean knows, at one point I went for 90 pages. I got trimmed out in part 7. But writing that way was just very different from the way I normally write, which is trying very hard to, I'm a songwriter, right? So a song comes in and a song's goal in 3 minutes is to punch you in the face 3 times, right? I mean, not necessarily in the face, maybe in the stomach, or caress your cheek gently 3 times, but to do the same thing 3 times with increasing efficacy and then be done, right? Whereas a big book, its job is to be your friend for a while. Even if you're a fast reader, you feel like you went through a great deal. Whereas I think with Wolf and White Van, you go through a single tunnel, right? And then run into a brick wall at the end of it, which I liked, right? And with Universal Harvester, you walk into a field, and then by the end, you understand that the field was kind of an enclosed space, right? But I wanted to explore in a much bigger, what they would talk about in video games as an open world, right? Where there's a lot of places to go, and where one of my favorite things to do in writing is to confound expectations, right? To upend you. There's this pronoun reveal in Universal Harvester, which is one of my favorite moments in my books, like where suddenly the ground seems to shift underneath you. I like to do that. That's one of my favorite things to do in fiction that's harder to do in song. So that's why I want to write a big book, is to explore those kinds of spaces.
Before we get too much further, I think it would help if I could get you to just tell us what the Devil House is, and just lay out the basic premise of what we're talking about here with the novel.
So the other thing I wanted was a structure. I mean, I'm formerly Catholic, and I'm in love with structures, right? So I wanted a mirror structure, right? So parts 1 and 7 would mirror each other, and that's how I thought of it. So how would you make a book that had a mirror thing going, just for the sake of it? And because that's sort of, for me, most writing begins as fun, right? And like Universal Harvester started because I wanted to make fun of the way at Iowa reunions, everybody talks about where everybody wound up. So the first chapter was just me riffing on what it's like to go to a family reunion in Iowa and go, where's Bill? Well, I thought he was in Spirit Lake. No, he was in Spirit Lake for a while, but he wound up in Urbandale. Oh, is that right? That sort of thing. And that's what the whole thing was about. With this, I thought if you had a mirror structure and something to interrupt it in the middle, that would be a lot of fun, right? So, and then I start thinking how mirrors, things, they fail to reflect exactly, right? But the story is about, the first level is that there is an author named Gage Chandler, who is a true crime writer, who has a technique that involves going to the place that he's going to write about, to the scene of the crime, right? And inhabiting it in some way, whether that involves breaking in or getting invited in, or in this case, buying the house, right, where something happened, and living there, and trying to soak up the atmosphere of it. So he is advised by his editor that there's a house in Milpitas, California, where something happened. It sounds right up his alley, and it's for sale, and it's cheap, right? And so he moves to Milpitas, which is a town near San Jose, where in fact I lived when I was a child. And so he moves to Milpitas. The thing that happened in the building happened when it was a porn store, and there were a couple of murders of a real estate developer from Southern California and a landlord from San Jose. And these murders happened, right? So he moves in, and the first part details the moving and that process. The second part is his first book, the one that made his bones, The White Witch of Morro Bay. Morro Bay is a town near San Luis Obispo. I lived in San Luis Obispo also when I was a child. The third part is the book he's working on, right? The middle part is something entirely different that I'm not going to go into. It's its own thing. And then the mirroring parts turn out to be somewhat different. That part 4 is some biographies of the people who survived the squatted porn store where the murders took place. Part 6 is a letter from someone who read The White Witch and has some ends to settle. And then part 7 is a meeting between me, John, and Gage Chandler, my character. And so it's and there's I mean, I can tell you all this without fear of revealing too much. The book is sort of made of trapdoors, and I like that about it. I mean, I think it's, I went to school in the 90s, so I think most books end up being about books and being about writing, and I think this one is about the responsibility of the author, and where that responsibility lies.
Let's talk a little bit more about that, since you brought it up, about that, responsibility of telling someone else's story.
Yeah.
And I'm mostly curious there, like, is that something that came from songwriting at all, or is that something that is really sort of specific to this kind of storytelling?
I actually think it has to do with it being the big book, because in songs, by the time you finish the song, if you have any questions about whether you have standing to tell that story, you have this good song up against you to say, well, do you really care about that or not? Or is this going to whip live? Which is like, that's the thing. It's like, if you have something that is effective, right? If you have something that makes people cry or makes people angry or makes people feel inspired, then these theoretical questions of who has standing to tell a story and so forth, not speaking demographically or anything, just general, stories of, a story of pain or whatever, are tabled because you have something effective in front of you, right? And that's going to tend to push other questions aside pretty easily. There is a song of mine called Going to Georgia that a lot of people write that I no longer sing, because it involves a guy showing up at his beloved's door with a gun in his hand, right? People really like this song. They really like to hear this song. And I sang it for a good 15 years before I went, I don't like this fellow. And I don't think that the song does enough to undercut how he clearly conceives of himself as very romantic. And if we're being straight, how I, at age 25, also found that quite romantic, right? And so I'm not connected to that 25-year-old anymore. God bless him. He brought me here, but I don't really, we're not pals anymore really that much. And so those questions sort of begin there, but you have leisure to do them when you're writing a big book, and you maybe set the book one place. And as you're writing, you go, I actually would rather set this in a place I used to live. I would actually rather have some standing to speak about it. And I think also these are things, when you're a young would-be writer and you're 10 years old and your teacher says, well, you should write what you know, and maybe that's because you're trying to write romantic relationships and your teacher's like, you're 10, what do you know, right? But if you're 10, you think, well, I don't know anything. What am I supposed to write about? I have to write, I don't want to write about kids, and that was very much me as a young writer. And so, so these questions start a long time ago, right? And I'm pretty resistive to them until I have a few books under me, and then I start to wonder, I start to ask about, well, I remember Bob Mezzi, my poetry professor who died last year, saying, I think it was when he was teaching us Browning, and you sort of get a taste in your mouth about how Browning is really relishing the murder in My Last Duchess, right? And he says, writers are monsters. They really are, It's like, and Bob was very proud of being a writer, right? And that really resonated with me. So, I mean, this is somewhat about that. I mean, the other thing is, if I write monsters, I always have sympathy for them. I don't sort of write the sort of nihilistic monster character who you're just supposed to unilaterally hate. I try to write complicated people who you neither love nor hate, but who seem like they exist in the world.
You were talking earlier about the personal connections to the work, and then before that, you were talking about your personal connections to Milpitas and Morro
I
Bay.
wish it had a slogan. I could then chant the slogan of Milpitas, but to the best of my knowledge, no.
And so, what did that bring to the work for you? That having all of that.
For one thing, much of many of the stories that are going around, the crime stories, have the sort of sense of urban legend, or of, if not urban legend, of the sort of the way that crimes, and I think this is different in the present age probably, but I grew up pre-internet, and if a terrible crime happened, word of it would spread on the playground, right, or on your street, right? You're playing with kids. My friend Scott in San Luis Obispo, but you hear about the son of Sam, right? Well, no, I didn't hear about the son of Sam. Now I'm only going to get it from Scott through this filter, right? Grapevine stuff, and I mentioned this in part 7, like the mean man who lived down the street, right? I bet you this was just a guy. I bet you there was nothing wrong with him at all. But his lawn was kind of parched, and he had a horseshoe in his window, and I don't think any of us knew that it was supposed to be good luck. It just looked kind of ominous, and I think maybe at some point he had shooed somebody off his lawn, but that became the house of the mean man, and nobody ever saw him, right? You'd walk past it and you'd see a glow in the window and think, well, there's a mean guy in there. And it really resonates like that. It's a sort of this ominous thing. Well, I get that best from thinking about places I was at. And also, I think I also mentioned my friend Darla, a girl whose last name I don't know, so I'll never be able to see what became of her, but who I lived next door to when I lived in Milpitas, right? Who did nothing but spread these stories of just insane crime stories of stuff that like physically could not happen. A woman whose leg grew so large that it protruded from the door of her house and she couldn't get out, right? And I remember her saying to me when I said, yeah, it's not practical. I'm 6 years old. And she says, no, all my stories are true. And I was like, and I'm a very credible guy, right? If you tell me something, I tend to believe it, right? Really a lot. I'm 54, but you can get away with a lot with me. And especially Darla, I had a gigantic crush on. So when she said that, I'm like, I'm accepted. So, okay, well, Darla only tells true stories. And that sort of forms me as a storyteller, that sort of that credulousness,
Right. Just a very quick question, I think, but Milpitas is mostly famous, I think, as the setting for River's Edge. And
yes.
That's obviously set around the same time and shares some themes. Did that affect you and your decision to?
Well, yeah, River's Edge is a big moment for, I don't know, people who, well, for me and some people I know from my generation, in that, I mean, one, I think Crispin Glover winds up committing to weird as a shtick, right? But at the time, he seemed like an incredibly exciting young actor doing pretty daring stuff with his character, doing a sort of a very expressionist sort of thing. It was a character you really recognized, if you were a California person, like the way that he was doing the shtick of everything matters the same as everything else, and it's all very intense. If you haven't seen this movie River's Edge, it's Crispin Glover's debut, and he does this thing where every he and his crew of teenagers are the only thing that matters. But this was also it was another case of a story that sort of gets its own. It has a version that exists in the public eye, right? And it's sort of like the story of Kitty Genovese, right? You remember, does anybody, if you don't know Kitty Genovese, she was a woman who was stabbed something like 37 times and died in an apartment complex in, I believe, New Jersey. And the word was that everybody in the complex had seen it from their windows and nobody called the cops. Nobody did anything. They just let her die. And this was a fable of the late 60s for a long time. Harlan Ellison wrote a story about it. It was a fable of human callousness, right, and self-interest. But it turns out years later that most of that is not true. It's based on a single newspaper story that framed things in that way to tell a story that we all kind of like to hear, that's very satisfying to us in some weird self-flagellatory way, right? And it is true that humans are callous, right? But at the same time, like, that story was not in fact true. And they made a documentary about it a couple of years ago. I'm really interested in that kind of thing. The River's Edge case, it happened, but it also was quite different from what wound up being the actual story. You can look it up on it's a very sad story. It's a terrible story of a guy who murdered his girlfriend, and his friends were taken to see the corpse and they didn't turn him in, right? Well, that's a brutal story, but there's a lot more to that story than, the movie winds up having like a young man who's like, he's messed up, but the kid who actually did it was hallucinating, right? The kid who actually did it was schizophrenic, and importantly was Black, right? And in River's Edge, they just made it a bunch of these callous heavy metal kids, right? That was the whole thing. Right. And this was from a whole different, he had grown up in a whole different social milieu than was painted by the movie. This is not to fault the movie. The movie's just telling a story, right? It's not actually telling the story of Marcy Conrad. It does not purport to be a true story, right? But in the public ear, it just becomes that. This is a thing that happened to Milpitas, right? And then I thought, what's that do to the town where I was a kid, right? How does everybody in Milpitas feel about this now? And I imagine that they feel kind of the way Iowa feels about how everybody thinks they know about Iowa because they see 3 days of footage of it during the primaries every 4 years, right? Then they know Iowa from the diners that
Sure.
that Brian from CNBC goes to or whatever, and so I thought about that sort of stuff.
While we have you here in front of all these folks, I do want to take the chance to talk about you as, I don't know, sort of your literary life, you as a reader. I mean, what it is that, got you excited to write books, and, what it is, yes, beyond a world of bread that you're reading. And maybe, I know you were a National Book Awards judge last year, and, maybe talk a bit about what that was like, and, what that feels like for you moving into this
I will.
world.
As you know, as in personal conversation, when I have gone on quite enough, you can cut me off, because I'm kind of a wind-up toy when you get me going. So, so reading was really important to me from a very young age. I read precociously. Right? It was sort of a party trick for my dad to hand me not a party, but I could read his textbooks before the divorce. My parents divorced when I was 5, but I was a really precocious reader, and I loved it more than anything. It was just like I was one of those kids. Weirdly to me, I stopped being that somewhere around 9, I think, because I needed friends, and real bookworms choose books over friends, right? Now I am a real bookworm at last, right? But in grade school, I couldn't be, I knew some bookworms, and they looked lonely, and I wasn't up for it. So I continued to read, and quite passionately, but not the way, God, who was it? Sabrina Wenrick, man. Nose in a book, had to be told by teachers, stop reading, right? Well, by that point, I'm also writing, right? And so I'm distracting myself. I'm kind of, as you might tell, my attention span goes all over the place, right? And so I love to read, but I also love to write, and I also love to draw pictures. I'm terrible at drawing pictures, but I enjoyed that, and to do all the things. I'm kind of hungry for all the things, right? But I read children's books, but it was C.S. Lewis. When I was 7 and 8, I got really into C.S. Lewis, and I went from there into Tolkien. My 5th grade teacher, Debbie Vansel, one of the 3 teachers to whom Universal Harvester is dedicated, read us The Hobbit, and we liked it so well that she went on and read Fellowship of the Ring and Two Towers out loud. It was every day after lunch. She would sit in front of us and read for an hour, right? And we all identified with these characters. We all learned how to write in Elven runes, and everybody had their own thing. I was Gollum, I could still write it. And it was a big deal. And so from there, I went through what seems to be a long science fiction phase. It was like a few years, but 6th, 7th, 8th, and early 9th grade, I was haunting paperback bookstores and buying horror paperbacks and science fiction paperbacks, like 10 at a time. And I was trying to get the classics in, reading Larry Niven, Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle's Lucifer's Hammer was a big one. And Harlan Ellison a lot, Carol Emschwiller, a lot of short stories. I was into the short stories, but and a lot of Barry Ann Malzberg, Michael Moorcock, all these were my people, right? And then somewhere in the middle of freshman year in high school, I wanted to read. I wanted to punch above my pay grade and
Sure.
above my weight, right? There's not to mix the metaphor, but and I started becoming the guy who carried around the portable Faulkner, right, at all times. And that was me. I was reading that and not Willa Cather, but what's her name? Oh my God, why brilliant stylist, short story writer, woman of the 20s and 30s. Blanking. She wrote. I mean, she's one of the great short story writers. Catherine Ann Porter. And reading that kind of stuff, and then getting into the decadence, and getting into Paul Celan, Georg Trakl. Then I got into drugs for a long time. I didn't read as much. And so that was me then, is like sort of going from strictly genre fiction, passionate genre fiction, going to conventions, right? And then sort of making a big leap to sort of your stereotypical cigarette smoking teenager. Most of my friends wanted to read Camus. I was not interested in Camus. I wanted to read American literature at that time. Now I read almost exclusively literature in translation. It's really, it takes a lot to get me to read a book in English. Nothing against it, but I do generally think that international fiction is sort of exploring the space of fiction in a different way from what American letters are doing. I'm not condemning American literature, but I'm more interested in what's going on in Croatia, especially Croatia right now. I've just been going nuts on that. Igor Stix, Jurgovic, God, who else? I actually read a Croatian book translated from Esperanto last week, which was really good. Its theme was largely Esperantists in Croatia. It was really good. So, but yeah, I mainly read literature translation because I sort of feel like a lot of European literature, especially, is still big ideas stuff, right? It's like the plot is there and is good, but it's trying to get you to sort of poke underneath that. When I write, I try to provide both. because I'm a performer, so I like a big effect, right? I want people to say that gave me chills, or that made me sick, or or maybe cry. I think those are the top three. So.
I think we're going to hand this off to.
You got three questions there. I'm so sorry.
But I do think people want to hear about your COVID experience. You were insanely productive, and you're now just off tour. So I thought maybe there's a bit to say about what it's like out there, and
yeah,
and then we can open it all up.
Cool. About my COVID. Well, so the thing is, like, I got home. This is in the press kit for the last album, but we had planned to make 2 albums. This is the thing. I had a productive lockdown, but I had a ridiculously productive 2019 too. It was pretty bonkers. I was working on this a lot, and I also wound up writing between 2018 and 2019 both Dark in Here and Getting into Knives. I just hit the vein, and that's the thing that happens with me, right? That I just sort of got in a thing where I wake up and go, well, what do you feel like making today? You're in the mood, right? And I decided to focus on songs, and I was like, some of the songs in Getting into Knives were written on consecutive days, like 3, just boom, boom, boom. So I wound up writing 2 albums worth of material, and my manager had this idea to record them both in 2 different studios, announce one, right? And then on the day of the first show of the tour in fall 2019, surprise, there's 2 albums, right? And the people at the first show, which was going to be 930 Club in DC, would be the first people to find out there was this whole second album recorded at a different studio with a different vibe and different session musicians sitting in, So we did all that, but in the middle of the second album, the gravity of the situation began to become apparent, right? And by the end of that week in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, the CVS next door had no toilet paper in it because people were making a run on toilet paper. And it was and I canceled my flight, and we drove home in the van instead to minimize contact. And when I got home, my son had 2 more days in school, and then they canceled school, right? Made it Zoom. And I said, oh, we're not going to tour, are we? It's like, this is not going to happen. So I started writing. I was fresh out of the studio. I was in a very creative space already. So I started writing. I made another album. I made 10 songs into my boombox at the rate of a song a day. I am a person, blessed be the name of God forever, who, if you tell me you must make new stuff and it has to be at least, I mean, I won't say good, but it has to be of your, whatever your level of quality is, it needs to be on that level. I can do that. I can do that at gunpoint, right? I mean, I don't want anybody to test that, but I can do that. If you tell me, write me something new. If you tell me what exactly to write, paradoxically, then I'm useless, right? If you say, oh, go write a story about this, I probably will fail you. It's like it all has to come from me. I would actually like to sound that out. That would be something interesting to me, would be to try and figure out how to work better under direct guidance, just out of, I don't know. Well, again, because I'm Catholic, and I think if I'm not in some sense doing what I've been told to do, then I'm failing my community and God. But generally speaking, I am capable of working every day without, I mean, I won't say without repeating myself, but then I'm of the opinion that most writers are circling the same theme all the time anyway. And so I don't worry about that, right? I'm telling stories. And if they wind up being about what stories mean to us, which I think is a big part of what I do, is about what stories are for people, for readers especially, but for everybody, and the best way to work through that big question is through telling stories, right? So I wrote that, and then I was revising the book. I will tell you, I didn't start another book. So I stayed focused on this one. So, which is not true. During the Universal Harvester edit process, that's what I got the idea for this. Is, oh yeah, I got something now. So, but yeah, I stayed pretty focused on this. That was the joy of the big one for me. Is like, and I said this to my family many times. Is like, the beauty of a big book is you can go back into it to work and always find yourself in a gigantic open space. When you work on a smaller book, once you've resolved part of it, it doesn't really hold any more for you to work on. You can go tinker. I don't think the books are perfect. I could go and tinker with this or that. With a big one, you can just go in and change everything, which happens several times here. You can just go, oh, okay, this section is something completely different. There's 60,000 words that Sean never saw that constituted the original part 5, right? And they will never be seen by anybody. And some of them were really good. There's the original draft of part 3, totally different. Sean never saw it. My wife was mad at me for throwing it away because it had some good stuff, but it wasn't the right book. And that's just sort of, I mean, I enjoy my work is the thing. I really, both my gigs, I like to work. I'm kind of a hands to work, hearts to God guy. I like to show up and work. So yeah, that's how I got productive under COVID. It's like, it was even more of an opportunity to go, well, now you don't even have the excuse of being on tour. So.
That's so great, but it's also so sad to hear that there are thousands of words that we'll never read.
There'll be more. There's always I can't think of what poet or translator, always more to say.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you, Sean, for doing this. We have a wonderful and very wide-ranging collection of questions here. So I'm going to start with this question. The Satanic Panic is a fascinating look at what you mentioned about stories we buy into that aren't true but become very prevalent. How much of that moment informed the mood of Devil House? And how much of that moment in history has shaped your idea of storytelling, especially as it relates to crime and fear?
So that's a great question, because yeah, the Satanic Panic is a theme of this book. It's like I don't address the moral panic that directly, although I mean, there's this scene at the end of part 3 where everybody starts talking, part 2 where everybody starts talking about a crime, right? Mm-hmm. And they immediately start filling in their own details and saying the things that they heard about. It's in the form of news footage of people outside a crime scene, right? A local crime scene, right? And I was a psychiatric aide at the height of the Satanic Panic, right? On a children's unit. And so I was not only in it, I was on what turns out to be the wrong side of it, right? In many ways. I mean, our whole goal was just to take care of the children who get brought to us. But the whole framing was legitimately a moral panic, right? And what we were taught, what our whole guys, and I was an aide under the supervision of a nurse and a doctor, was, and there's a book, sort of the book to read on this subject is called "We Believe the Children," right? And that was, I mean, look, that's a completely moral and good stance. I believe the victim, right? Yeah. You don't want to be the person going, well, you say something happened to you, but I got to ask you a question. I mean, who are monsters do that, right? But at the same time, that's a very unsubtle framing, right? It's like, do children make stuff up? Of course they do, right? Will they make stuff up to try and please me if I'm their father and they love me? My God, my children would make up every story in the book and come up with it today to try and make me feel good. And if they had a doctor going, and your dad told me that you had a story to tell, and they were alone in a room with a doctor, you don't know, right? And this was in the context of a moral panic, so many weird, funky things can happen, right? And did happen, right? Innocent people went to prison for a long time over that, right?
Right.
And well, from a storytelling perspective, this is about my theme. This is about what stories can do and what we do with stories and what the responsibility is we have to one another and to ourselves about the nature of the stories we tell, and about asking ourselves questions about why we tell ourselves these sorts of stories. You know, what's in it for me if this is the story I construct, right? And mind you, you know, some people who weigh on the satanic panic, you know, then say it was all bullshit. Well, that's not true, right? There's child abuse is very real. You know, I'm a survivor of child abuse, but ritual satanic child abuse actually is extraordinarily rare. And at the scale that they were talking about, is just like, you know, books like Michelle Remembers. I'm kind of obsessed with this stuff. Do you know this book? Mm-hmm. And Michelle Remembers, there's no way all that stuff could have happened just in real time. And Michelle, the author of Michelle Remembers, turns out to be, you know, a con artist, but probably more than that, a very sick person who has very real issues, you know, that might have been addressed in therapy, but instead she ends up performing this thing. And then everybody in the Christian community has her on every TBN program. Oh, she's telling you the truth about what's going on. And none of that was true, literally none of it, right? And she had several identities after she was Michelle, right? I'm now, you know, all moral questions about all this stuff aside, I'm super interested in that. Who is not interested in a con artist, especially me? Because I was saying to you earlier, I'm a very credible person. Like, generally speaking, when you talk to me, you're getting 100% of me. I'm not good at pretending to be somebody, you know, it's like, and I never have been. I remember, you know, the first time I tried to lie to my father, he just very gravely said, "Now, is that a lie?" And I remember going, "Oh my God." It's like, I can't, I'm incapable. And like, and I have many stories from my childhood of like me and a friend having a secret and both of our well-being hinging on neither of us ratting each other out, and me saying to my friend Darla's face, "I'm going to tell on us," right? It's like, I can't not do it. If I've done something, I'll tell you. So these con artist people who are capable of telling big lies for whatever reason, they're interesting to me. In part because I also never do believe that they're just bad people. You know, I think there's more to them than that, generally speaking. Generally speaking, not always. In the political arena, I'm less willing to cut them a break.
Yeah. I'm the same way. I verge on the edge of gullible myself about some things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, this is a self-serving opinion, but I feel that that's a morally good quality to have.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take that. Yeah. So that was a question about perspective a little bit. We have another question about perspective here. Ben asks, I think you've said before that you've thought about writing a book set in England, but you feel like you'd rather work in a setting where you've lived yourself. Would love to hear more about this idea if there's anything there. I always enjoy when the UK shows up in Mountain Goat songs. Being from there myself, it's a fun perspective on where I live.
So yeah, I have actually, there were parts of this book that were originally set somewhere else. And when I got to a certain point, I said, you know, I don't have the standing to say that. I wasn't here then, right? Setting it in history, right? Now, I think it depends on where in history you're setting something, right? If we're writing a historical novel, right, which I've read several, I can remember the one I read about 10 years ago about an Angle king or a pre-Saxon king. I can't remember what it was. It was probably Robin Cadwallader was the author. But writing those, then nobody was there. So all we have to do is do research, and nobody can come up and say, hey, you really messed this up, right?
Right.
But if I was there, right, then I can attest, and especially if I'm a reliable person, I can say, look, I'm only talking about things that seemed true when I was there, right? I'm trying not to. And with Milpitas, I cheated a little bit. I wasn't there in the early 80s, but I was there in the mid 70s. The big change that came later with tech is not that huge yet. So I feel like I have a pretty good line on the place I used to live. And it is about what I said this book is about. This book is sort of about who has standing to tell a story and about people's investments in those stories. And I think a good place to start telling that story is where you're from. I am, however, almost out of places that I have lived as a conscious human being, unless I set my next book in 80s Portland. I'm going to have to, which I don't think I want to do.
No, it sounds fascinating.
I mean, I could, but England, actually, when I write about England, I do actually have a bit of a feel for England. It's the country I think I've spent the most time in after the US. And I like to think a lot, especially about outside of London. The thing is, I think the areas, my feel for the places that aren't London in England is sort of very similar to my feeling for the places for being from the West Coast. If you're growing up in the 80s and you're from the West Coast, all the bands came to New York first. You got everything second, right? You never saw the band before everybody else. You never saw the movie before anybody else. You get a major inferiority complex about this, which you then perform as a superiority complex. And I think anybody who lives in a satellite of the big city gets this vibe, right?
Yeah.
But it's different in the Midwest because things are so different between Chicago and elsewhere, right? Even Chicago, Minneapolis. But in England, right, you have London, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like nothing is even close to London. But there are these major cities where you can live and die, I've always been pretty interested both in the North and the West. I wonder what I could do with Leeds. I'm pretty interested in Leeds because it's one of my favorite clubs is there. So I could conceivably, although I would also be I think I'm pretty good with dialogue now. And I think Americans are legendarily bad at affecting English speech patterns, British speech patterns, right? And I think I have an ear for them, but I don't know how I could write them. But the thing is, like, this is the sort of question that gets me going is like, well, what could I set in England? Although I will spoil this book and tell you that it does have some parts that take place in England of very, very long ago. But that England, was that ever England? Who can say?
Mm-hmm. That's the question. I love those parts of this book. I really enjoy the style.
I'm so glad you do. They too were originally much longer, and you have Sean McDonald to blame if you wanted more.
I wanted more of every part of this book. It felt like, every turn that you took, it was for a moment jarring, and then I got into it, and you could have gone on for many more pages.
Oh, thank you. It's a great relief because it is an anxiety for me in writing a long book is like, will people have had enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm always trying to cut it off early. Again, I'm a songwriter. It's like, it's best, if you're doing, 3 verses and a chorus, to get out early rather than get out late. Although it's another thing I've been interested in lately is how can you stretch the groove in such a way that 8 minutes pass and it feels like 3,
Yeah, I will say, like, from an aesthetic or an artistic point of view, definitely better to leave people a little bit disappointed than to bore them. But from a reader point of view, being disappointed, sometimes you wish for some more. Yeah. That's an interesting line to find. Okay, another question. Zachary says, do you consider your characters in all of your novels to be written into the same universe?
No, not in all the novels. That's not my style.
Okay.
The thing is, I will say because I'm always thinking about writing, I think any writer's characters in the long run are all taking place in the same universe for that writer, right? But that's not the one you see on the page anyway, right? I'd be talking more in a moral and a Jungian archetypal universe, right? But no, they won't be running across each other. I know that we live in an age of big series of books, right, where people like to be inhabiting the same world at that length. But no, they live, because it's set in the real world, they would live contemporaneously. But I'm not thinking about the one when I'm thinking about the other. Once I put a stop on a book, I'm that whole world kind of goes away from me. It's like it's self-contained within that book.
Yeah, well, this world is so wholly absorbing. I think having other things intrude into it might be distracting more than anything else.
I will say parts 2 and 6 were such, I can't say a pleasure,
Mm-hmm.
so satisfying to write
Uh-huh.
that I'm curious to go back to San Luis Obispo, Morro Bay some more. I don't think I will, but that would probably be the first place I'd go back to. Is like, I mean, the thing is, like, Gage, the narrator, I like his book. What we see of his of part two.
Yeah.
I like his weird idea about writing in the second person.
Yeah.
Oh, that's the other thing about the structure of the book. I'll spoil this for you. So the mirror is parts 1 and 7 are in the first person, parts 2 and 6 are in the second person, parts 3 and 5 are in the third person, and then part 4 is something else, right?
Yeah.
And so, and that was one of the original framing concepts for me, was to do something like that created a mirror that winds up facing itself at an angle every time it turns. So
yeah, it's so fascinating. I just saw Kathy said in the chat she's so excited to read this book. You should be. It is great, and I'm excited to go back and reread it, having had this conversation now, and look for those things that I might have missed before. Okay, we're running out of time, but I have this great question again from Zachary. Thank you. I know previously you stated that your music and novels don't collide, despite fans thinking In the Shadows of the Western Hills seems to connect really well with Wolf and White Man. Is this still the case for Devil House and the music you've written currently, or the music you've written recently or are currently working on?
I mean, yeah, but as I say, thematically as a writer, I don't think my songs are quite as self-reflective about their own process as books. I mean, I think books are sort of inherently self-reflective. From the earliest books we have, at the end of a book in the 15th century, Chaucer will say, "Go little book, go little mind tragedia," right? They're talking about the books, right? They're inside the book. The book is about itself in some way. I don't think that's true of songs necessarily. Songs are so direct, even though they're quite artificial at the lyrical level. A song is an attempt to really smash through my songs anyway, and a lot of them are. There's also bands like Scritti Politti who are doing a different project, but a song is sort of an attempt to break that fourth wall, right? To establish something as close to physical connection as you can really do, to make it feel like, I'm inside your head, my voice is right there. When you read me, right, and this is where audiobooks are kind of weird. When you read me, it's your own voice you hear, right? I'm not, whatever I did is sort of just a map for what you wind up doing when you read, right? And the reader has more power than the writer in that sense. So they're so different. I don't think that there's that much connection, but it's also hard for me to say. I wouldn't be the person to ask. I mean, I wouldn't say anybody could authoritatively say, well, here's this connection here, but it wouldn't surprise me to find that some songs wind up having thematic, deep theme, like the theme of responsibility. But like, like the violence of part 2 and 3, or the prolonged emotional violence of part 6. These aren't things I would be doing in song. It'd be like Joanna Wentz Wild Women with Steak Knives piece. Like, that's not what I do, So I don't know what connection there really is there. But I'm open to readings that say there is one.
So everyone should read and listen carefully, is what I'm hearing.
That's right.
We have a couple, like, maybe quick answer questions. One is, are you enjoying the new Innistrad block for Magic the Gathering?
Yeah, I haven't really figured it out. I just got home from tour the other day. So Innistrad, for those of you who don't play Magic, is set on a planet with werewolves and vampires. It's a horror theme one. It's fresh for fall. Innistrad is an old planet. It's from lore from a few years back, so it's a returning one. As is usually my case, I've drafted once and just got completely destroyed. But in Constructed, I'm doing some cool things. Although I will say right now, most of what I'm doing is still dungeon related stuff. The Strixhaven, was it Strixhaven or no? Forgotten Realms has this mechanic of going into the dungeon. I'm having a lot of fun with that. Right, I'm kind of crushing it with that right now, to be honest.
Cool. This is all over my head, but it sounds cool. Okay, and we'll end on this question. And thanks again for taking the time to do this. This has been so much fun. Would you ever consider publishing a book of poems?
Like, of my lyrics or poems? I don't make much of my poems. Although, I wonder if I can dig up. Let's see here. What was it called? stick with me for a minute here and see if I can find, there's that. No, those aren't good. Oh no, I know. Where is it? I'm gonna find you something.
Great.
If I can, was it prophecies? No. They have to. Oh, there they are. Yes. So actually, Sean doesn't know this. This book's this book's first incarnation was back in 2013. I got an idea to write a cycle of 1,000 poems, right? Because these are the sorts of ideas that I get, and sometimes I run with it and wind up writing a gigantic book, and sometimes I write what looks like about 15 poems and then move on, right? And decide that I don't. But those of you who read the book will actually recognize something that I later did with a little linguistic. I like that one too, actually. I happen to like these poems, but I don't actually think they're good. Is the thing is like, I hold myself to a very high standard with poetry. My professor was Bob Mezzi. And so I hold myself to a high standard always and everywhere. But if my poem doesn't completely knock me over, then I generally don't share it. But I will make an exception for the people who've been good enough to join us today. So there was a character, this all took place in Central California. It hadn't been identified as Milpitas. There was a character named Nash, who is the ominous guy in the Camaro or Trans Am. And I was going to write 1,000 poems called The Speed Metal Prophecies, about a crime that takes place among teenagers, where one of them probably kills the other one. It would have been rooted on the Ricky Casso case in Long Island, which you can look up, but I don't recommend it. Just be assured that somebody was killed terribly. That's all you need to know. It's not fun to read about. But so here is one of those poems. And if you don't like it, then you'll see why I probably don't expect to publish a book of poems. Face gazing out through pines, airbrushed on the hood of a Trans Am. So many years since high school, I can barely make out the details. Throbbing of the new Kenwood. Kenwood used to make car stereos. Throbbing of the new Kenwood. Up to the curb, he sidles. As for that, she says, I shall not ride with you.
Wow.
They're all kind of elusive like that. None of them resolve. I was pretty interested in them as a process for a while. And so those are kind of the first draft. Wow, my rough plan is here in my documents. No one will ever see these. Yeah, The Speed Metal Prophecies is an epic poem consisting of 10 books. So it says at the beginning of my extremely ambitious document. So a prologue in which the stories to be told and their principles are introduced, and the stories of the people who comprise the circle of 9. Well, as you know, if you've read the book, we have a putative circle of 7 in Milpitas, right? So I did fold that into this. If I wound up writing approximately 898 more poems, or no, more like 920 more poems, then we could have a poem cycle that takes place in roughly the same fictional universe as these.
Oh my gosh, that would be amazing.
I'd say, well, talk to Sean. It's very hard to get the commission to write 1,000 poems.
That's true. Someone says so next month then.
Next, I'll see you then, bud. Don't even dare me. Gosh. Don't even dare me. I'll be in a 2 months in 10 days.
Well, thank you. That was such an unexpected treat that we got at the end there. Thanks everyone for sticking around.
Yeah, thanks y'all. It's fun to see people. You know, I don't see people during my days because I still keep fairly locked. We're not at the vaccination rate we need to be at yet for me to feel like running around all.
Yeah.
As if I did that to begin with.
Yeah, we also don't see very many people working from home, so this is always always a treat for me to do things like this. And this has been particularly wonderful. So thank you for taking the time. Thanks, Sean. For
can I see everybody briefly? Can everybody else be let on camera, or not? Is that
not the whole audience? I don't think we can bring everyone in the audience on camera, but those of you who are in the green room, Molly, Steve, if you want to jump on camera and wave real quick, we can have.
Yeah, where's Molly?
Yeah, where is Molly? Molly's the real star of this show. She might be off dealing.
Molly bailed. She had enough.
This was so great. Thank you so much, John.
My pleasure. Let me give a thank you to everybody in chat.
Yeah.
I'll see you all when I see you out there, and I hope you enjoyed the book. I'm pretty proud of it. I now return to signing book plates.
Yes, great. As you should be proud of it. And we hope everybody remember to enter the sweeps for a giveaway of the book so you can get a hard copy, because it is one to have and cherish. So, all right. Thanks, everyone. We'll say good afternoon.
Thank you all.
Have a great one. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.